Welcome, everyone. My name is Ketty Wilkerson, and I'm part of the Skoll Foundation team. I'm very excited to welcome you to the Skoll World Forum session, Making the Future of Work, Work for All. This year, the theme is Closing the Distance, and we thought there was no better way to reflect that theme than to invite our global network to design and build a new kind of event together. So before we begin, I want to share a few quick things. This session is being recorded and will be released publicly after the event. Please feel free to use the chat to engage with each other and to ask questions to the speakers. The session is scheduled to end in 60 minutes. After the session, please take a few seconds to complete the survey in the poll tab to the right of the hop-in video. Finally, on social media, we are using the hashtag SkollWF and would love for you to do the same. We're so thrilled to be able to include this session in this year's virtual Skoll World Forum and want to extend a special thank you to Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator for proposing and designing it. With that, I'd like to introduce Sharmi Suryanarayan.
Thank you, Kathy. Nice to meet you all, and hello everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Sharmi Suryanarayan, and I am the Chief Impact Officer of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. I am so delighted to host this session, Making the Future of Work, Work for All. I am going to start with a little bit of a recap of what the session is about for some of you, and then introduce our fabulous panelists. We really have a rock star group of panelists here. And just to give you a sense, I mean, for years, we've heard from experts about around the world that the future of work is about to come, and they talk about jobs that don't exist, school systems that don't prepare us for new work, and new kinds of tools and technologies that are going to disrupt the system. But up until last year, really, prior to the pandemic, this discussion was mostly speculative. Over the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic has both accelerated the arrival of the future of work, but it's also exposed and exacerbated fundamental inequalities that have always simmered beneath the surface. Never before has it been more urgent and important to address and design a future of work that works for all. And so I'm thrilled to host this incredible panel with 5 people that I also call my friends. And if you will indulge me, I'm excited to just introduce a little bit of a chuckle before we actually start the panel itself, but would want to give you a sense of how we're going to run this show. So for those of you who are actually familiar with the US talk show host, The View, which was started and co-created by Barbara Walters and was a daytime talk show host with diverging opinions around subjects with really interesting people, we want to replicate The View for the future of work. So I want to introduce you to our panelists who have graciously allowed me to portray them in this avatar. On the left, you have Mariana Iskander, who's the CEO of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. I'm thrilled to call her my colleague. Harambee is a social enterprise that designs African solutions to the global challenge of unemployment. Next, we have Ann-Mei Chang, who is the author of Lean Impact, a technology leader who in her role as Senior Engineering Director at Google helped introduce the world to Google Maps and Gmail. But importantly, was an author of a book called Lean Impact, How to Innovate for Radically Greater Social Good. Next, we have Aisha Pandor, who takes on the role of Whoopi Goldberg here. She's the founder and CEO of sweepsouth.com, which is a platform based in South Africa and Kenya and now growing to West Africa. And it connects clients with home services using technology. Next, we have Fred Swaniker with this fabulous updo. Fred needs no introduction. He's an African visionary, and he put African leadership on the map. And his African Leadership Group, which he co-founded and is now the CEO of, is committed to developing millions of ethical and entrepreneurial leaders for the African continent. And last but not least, and I really hope she's able to join because she's having some technological challenges, but Ambassador Jessica Le Pen, who is the US Ambassador to the African Union. She's an ecosystem influencer and was former chargé d'affaires in Johannesburg in South Africa, as well as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Kigali in Rwanda. So thank you all for allowing me to start off the conversation on a chuckle, and I hope that you'll agree with me that this is a really luminous group of panelists. And without further ado, firstly, welcome to this panel, and so great to have you.
Thank you, Charmy.
Great to be here.
Delighted to be here.
Thanks, Shami. Good to be here.
Terrific. So we're going to run this as a highly interactive conversation and hoping that everyone can join in and have some views, as we've said. I'm going to run this as a series of 4 prompts, and I'm going to direct my prompts to 2 panelists to start with, and then have people comment. And I'm going to start up with you, Fred. Your first prompt is, what is your view on the future of work in Africa today? And I'll follow you with Aisha, so I should be ready with your responses, but your first question is to you.
Thanks, Shami, and love the do that you throw on my head. So, you know, I'm normally the most optimistic person in the world, but right now, I would say that things are looking pretty bleak when it comes to work for young people, especially in Africa. You know, the pandemic has led to huge job losses in Africa and around the world. And the people most affected, unfortunately, have been youth. But that's in the short term. In the medium to long term, I'm much more optimistic, right? So I think once this pandemic is over, we're going to have what we call the great rehiring, where companies will suddenly need to rehire millions of workers back to get business, you know, back on the rails once the economy recovers. And therefore, it's going to be an exciting time for young people to find work. And one of the things I also believe is that constraints drive innovation. And so coming out of the pandemic, which is a period where the world has been really constrained, I see a huge boom in innovation and entrepreneurship. I see new ventures being started, especially that leverage technology. And I think Africa will be able to leapfrog and find more creative ways to deliver you know, goods and services. So there's going to be a great opportunity for young people to become entrepreneurs. And these new entrepreneurs themselves will be hiring. And finally, I think that this pandemic has opened up our markets for Africa's youth to work. Because one of the things that it has done is that companies all over the world are now a lot more open to remote work, remote to hiring remote talent. So I think that if we can get our act together, African youth can now work all over the world. And that expands the demand side for employment, expands the markets. And literally the world will be the oyster for young Africans. As the rest of the world is aging, you know, the average German or Japanese is 47. In Africa, the average age is 19. So we have the greatest store of untapped talent in the world. And so I think this opens up huge opportunities for our youth if we can export our talent, but without the brain drain, because they can actually stay in Africa and work remotely. But of course, for that to happen, governments need to remove roadblocks like access to data, electricity, and so forth to allow our youth to be able to work globally. But these are some of the exciting opportunities that I see happening, you know, once we get out of this dark moment.
Thanks, Fred. I appreciate that. Aisha, over to you. What is your view?
You know, I think Shami is similar to Fred in a lot of ways, in that I definitely, you know, I feel very hopeful. I think when you have such a young, you know, energetic population, I think it's very difficult not to feel hopeful about what we can become. But I also think, and, you know, I know we're going to touch on some of the ifs. There's some really big ifs that have to fall into place for us to be able to realize this potential. I think, you know, there are a lot of industries that our continent has historically depended on for growth. I think that, you know, the future of employment and employment and work depending on youth means that we're going to have to really radically de-invest from those industries, you know, so and really look towards the future. There's that great quote by I think one of the prime ministers of the UAE, and he said, you know, my grandfather rode a camel, my father rode a camel, I ride a Mercedes, my son will ride a Land Rover, his son will ride a Land Rover, and then his son will ride a camel. And it sort of talks to the need to really start shifting away from a dependence on, you know, in their case, oil, and start looking towards technology. And I think we've got to do the same thing. on the continent. I think we need different types of skills to be able to take advantage of the opportunities for work in the future. I think in addition to sort of looking at things like digital literacy, I think, and Shami, you talked about, the pandemic and how that's just thrown the world into disarray, and there's a high level of uncertainty. I think we need to shape leaders who are more swayed towards a focus on creativity, on being able to deal with uncertainty, on being problem solvers, and being able to leverage networks. And all of those things, I think, are opportunities that increased access to the internet and to the digital world can present without them needing to take place, in a classroom with a teacher. And then I think lastly, some of my hope comes from being a female entrepreneur in the tech space. And I think my hope is also that the shifts that we're seeing will see better and broader participation of women in work. And that will result in more decision-making by women and more belonging for women in the workspace. So yeah, lots of sort of dependencies and contingencies, but overall, I feel really, really hopeful.
Thanks, Aisha. I think those are really great opening statements, and I think that's a really helpful perspective, both Fred and Aisha, the short-term and the longer-term view. I'm going to ask our next couple of panelists to respond to this next question. Jesse, I think, is still trying to get on, so I'm going to start with you, Mariana. What gives you hope for the future? You heard a little bit from Fred and Aisha about what gives them hope for the future: youth, digital literacy, the promise of opportunity. What do you consider giving you hope for the future?
Thanks for that, Sharmi. I mean, actually listening to Fred and Aisha's comments is part of what gives me, I think, a sense of hope. We're here on this panel to talk about where Africa can give the rest of the world some of the solutions. And I think that Fred's observation about constraint driving innovation is exactly right. I also think, and it's reflective of the moment that we're in now, is that I think Dr. King's kind of adage that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, means without a bit of a long view, it is hard to be totally optimistic. We have got to take the long view in terms of, frankly, rewiring our systems and our society, not just trying to solve for today's issues, I think, with yesterday's solutions. And I will say that Aisha's observation about the role of women, whether it's in the tech and entrepreneurship space, the role of women in leadership spaces, boardrooms, I think is a real opportunity to think about how to rewire and not just try to keep fixing. I think Jesse's joined us, Sharmi, but we'll see, and hand back over to you.
Thanks, Mariana. Jesse, I don't know if you can hear us and if you can unmute at this point, hoping that you can. We're still on our second round of questions about what gives you hope for the future. We'll just give you a minute to see if you can join. Oh no, I think we're still struggling to unmute. So sorry about that, Jesse. I'm gonna try and see if we can assist you with unmuting. But we'll perhaps come back to you towards the end and see if that we can connect to you again regarding this particular question. So I think there's a theme beginning to emerge here, which is around constraints driving innovation, sort of the opportunity with the digital space, female entrepreneurship, and a huge range of possibilities as well. So, and Aisha, you referred to this briefly, which is a lot of this rides on the ifs. So we need to get quite a few things done in order to see this future of work and have it be more inclusive. So, Anne May, let me turn it over to you. What are the big ifs that this future of work hinges on? And what do you think needs to happen before we can see this reality come to fruition?
Thank you, Sharmi. I do agree with the other panelists that there's so much potential, but I also think that it's not a given that that we're going to realize the future we want. If we're going to do so, I think we need to get serious about three things, and that's innovation, scale, and collaboration. And just to talk briefly about each of them, We often are so fixated on getting to the perfect solution. This new solution is going to fix everything. And I think what we need to recognize, and I think people are increasingly recognizing in this past year, is that the world is constantly changing. The problems are changing. The nature of solutions that are going to work is changing. And so I would argue that we need to get more comfortable with the idea that what we should be seeking is not the perfect solution, but trying to figure out how to craft organizations that are nimble, that are able to respond quickly and adapt quickly to changing conditions and new information, so that we are constantly learning and iterating and improving on the solutions that we have. The second is we need to get serious about scale. We can't just keep running programs that reach a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the population and that end after 3 or 5 years. We need to think about this more as a systems change problem, and that means finding sustainable sources of funding that will eventually allow us to really scale to the size of the need. We're talking about tens of millions, not hundreds of millions of people here we're going to need to bring along into this future. And finally, we need to get serious about collaboration. I've had the fortune to work in the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector. And what I've seen is that magic happens at the intersection of these sectors. And that's why it's so exciting. The panel we have today, we have people who are working in each of these sectors and working across them, because none of us can solve these problems alone. It requires collaboration. It requires collaboration not only across sectors, but across actors within each sector, because these are massive problems, and we need to leverage the best of all the talents we have and all the resources we have in order to solve them. So I think if we can do those three things, innovate, scale, and collaboration, we're going to be in a much better position to solve these huge challenges in front of us.
Fabulous. Thank you, Anne-May. And I think that's really resonates with all of the work that we, I think, collectively are doing. Innovate, scale, collaborate. Aisha, I'm turning over to you. You mentioned the ifs in your response. What, in your view, what are the ifs that need to be addressed?
I completely agree with Anne-May, and I think in addition to doing that, a big if has to be just being more comfortable with risk taking. I think both on an individual level, who want to be part of the future of work, but also I think, on behalf of governments, on behalf of all of these supporting organizations in an ecosystem that's trying to foster better, innovation, for example. So I think we have to be a lot more comfortable with failure. I think to do that, we have to do, as Anne-May said, which is, don't necessarily make the big jump, but, take the first step and iterate off of that. I think people need to have a security net so that, and I'm talking about things like a UBI, for example, but, a security net, which means that you're able to take risks and to engage in the risk of innovation. But I think, if we look at what's at stake, it should justify, potentially giving up a lot to be a participant in this future that we're all hopeful about.
If I can jump in here, I totally agree with Aisha that risk-taking is so key and so foreign to the development sector that we often are so risk averse because our funders want us to deliver the things that we say we're going to deliver. We have immediate needs that we want to meet, and so we don't cast a wider net for things that can leapfrog the current solutions, and that holds us back. Just one example from my own experience, I many years ago was working with a team on trying to create a solution that is not dissimilar to what you guys are doing with Sweet South, Aisha. And we tried to put together, help youth connect with jobs, cleaning homes, and other things. And we're getting youth that were excited, and we're getting customers that were excited. But the problem was we were losing money with every transaction. And the team was so excited because there were people who were excited on both sides of this coin that they just kept plowing forward and wanting to keep doing the thing, even though we were just going to run into a wall. right? And so I think it's really important to step back and be able to recognize, with some humility to recognize, even though people may be excited, that's one important step, but we also need to figure out ways to make what we're doing sustainable and scalable so that we really are going to be able to stay around and serve, really serve the need that exists in the world.
Absolutely.
Sharmi, can I just jump in to ask Fred a question, just based, Fred, on your starting observation? I mean, I think Anne-May's point is right that people being energized isn't always enough for systems level solutions. One thing I think we have observed in the pandemic is at least a little bit more openness that we've got to try some new things from, I would say, partners who maybe in the past were much more risk averse. I think governments coming to grips with the reality that like something's got to shift in what is happening. So while, I mean, again, one has to take a long view, I certainly see that the conversations feel a little bit different because I think people are understanding that something has to shift quickly. And I'm just wondering whether you've seen that and experienced that on the continent in your work as well.
Yes, certainly. I mean, as I just mentioned earlier, constraints drive innovation, right? So governments, regulators, everyone are now feeling the heat, right? Because, suddenly millions of people are unemployed, and those young people are, if you're government, that's political instability for you, right? If you're a regulator, you have to think differently, for example, about higher education. We're finding a lot more openness from regulators to think differently because we've been forced to do things differently, right? So, about 3 years ago, I gave a talk at school when we could actually do this in person. And I talked about how we had 6,000 days left before Africa had the largest workforce in the world by 2035. Today, we have about 5,020 days, right? So we've lost 1,000 days already. The clock is ticking. And it's we've just been thrown into an even deeper hole with the pandemic. So what that means is that the pressure for change is much, much higher now than it's ever been. And so I'm seeing that governments are a lot more open, regulators are a lot more open, young people are a lot more open to trying new ways of learning and getting skills, employers are a lot more open. So it's wonderful that we have these constraints because it's going to force us to do things differently. And that's why I think that if we just wake up and look and see the reality of the situation, we're going to end this pandemic than we were before.
Yeah, and Fred, I agree that constraints breed innovation. I also think crisis breeds innovation. I've seen so much innovation in this past year, people breaking out of their usual habits because we were forced to, because what used to work stopped working. And it's really interesting because I've talked to many organizations who, have been planning for months, in some cases years, to bring some of their services into the virtual world. And then all of a sudden they were forced to do so. And they started learning so much more quickly than they did when they were just debating this in their conference rooms, right? And so I hope that this is like a kick in the butt for all of us to be able to take some of those chances, be able to try some different things, be able to take some risks.
Mm-hmm. I mean, before, if you wanted to meet a government minister, you have to go and wait outside the office all day. Now they'll get on Zoom and talk to you, right? Government ministers have had to learn how to use Zoom and how to work virtually. So all of this is suddenly realizing, oh wow, there's different ways of doing things. We can move faster.
Thanks, everyone. I think the ifs are really important, and I think for us, we're also innovators, and I think, Aisha, your call to action about taking more risks is critical, especially during the pandemic. I think this is the time where we take the risks and actually design for a future that we can imagine together collectively. So all four of you are experts in the field. We're hoping that Jesse still can get to join us, but I have a question to each of you, which I would love to start with you, Aisha. If you had one radical big bet idea that you could invest your time, energy, and resources in, I know you're working on Sweep South, and that's pretty fabulous already, but what would it be? What would that radical idea be to disrupt and to change and shape the future of work? And I'll call on the others after.
So Sharmi, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and just about three sort of ideas more than one concrete thing. But I think so the one would be, and I talked about the UBI, the universal basic income, or just having more widespread social protection for people so that they're able to take risks. So I think that would be one thing, and just having that being a continent-wide norm. The second thing would be having a complete overhaul of our education systems. Sometimes I'm just shocked at the fact that we still in our schools have education systems which have been around for centuries and haven't really changed much. And I think education systems which both focus on creativity and innovation and EQ and empathy and problem solving, but also that specifically look at what are the skills that we need to nurture in people to fit them to what they want to do. So you shouldn't be doing subjects necessarily, and sort of be graded on them and your future is dependent on them, that just go against the grain of who you are as a person. And then I think the last thing would be that I think every country on the continent should have a 50% quota for government members being younger than the age of 35.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Aisha. Fabulous. Thank you. That was cheeky. Those are three. But May, what is your radical disruptive idea?
Well, I'll try to stick with one here. I would suggest this, what we've seen in this past year is that access to the internet is so necessary to thrive in the modern world. And especially during the pandemic, we saw this where people were not able to access education if they didn't have internet access. They weren't able to access healthcare. They weren't able to work and stay in communication with their loved ones. And so access to internet, I think, is so foundational to what Fred was talking about being able to export the talent that we have in Africa without the brain drain. And so I think we need a big movement to get everyone online. That access to the internet should be as basic as access to safe drinking water or shelter or otherwise. And I think that one of the mistakes we make when we think about access to internet is that we think about, okay, we're going to embark on these expensive projects to lay cables and fly drones or whatever, balloons or whatever other technology thing it is. But the World Economic Forum did a study where they estimate that 75% of people who are not connected are already covered by existing networks. So 75% of people who aren't online could get online tomorrow without us creating any more infrastructure. And I think that's a much easier problem to solve, even though it's still hard. And it involves both looking at affordability, making sure internet access is affordable to people. That's both devices as well as the cost of data, and has a lot to do with the regulatory environment and ensuring that there's healthy market competition everywhere. And it also has to do with digital skills and digital content, that we need to make sure that people have the skills, that they know how to use the internet, they know how to make use of it for to kind of meet their own goals, and we need to have content that's actually relevant to them in their local languages, in their local context. And so if we can do these things, we can really bring a whole continent online. The estimates are that 60% of Africa is not yet accessing the internet regularly. So if we can bring everybody online, I think we're going to have a much better opportunity both to upskill people using the platform, as well as have people be able to access opportunities to contribute in the global market.
Thanks, Anne-May. I think that's powerful because it's infrastructure that can unlock the potential for millions. So that's a really fantastic point. I'm going to go over to Mariana. Your big idea and disruptive idea that could be used to shape the future of work.
So yesterday in the opening plenary of the Skoll World Forum, which I must say you should go watch if you missed it, there was a segment where the award-winning chef, Jose Andres, who's the founder of the World Central Kitchen, spoke to NPR journalist Rachel Martin. And he tells the story of a small village where two young girls, he said they're around ages 8, 9. They would come rush him to hurry up and get the food ready. And it wasn't because they were going to eat it, but because they knew that their job was to first serve the somewhere between 200 to 300 elderly households in their community. And only when they finished that would they themselves eat. So they needed him to get busy prepping the meals so that they would have the time to finish all the deliveries and only then be able to eat themselves. And he reflected in this pretty poignant moment. He says, I'm here for this work for those girls. And these girls are everywhere in the world, in every village. And I think that if we took the bulk of the billions and the trillions that are being spent around the world on economic stimulus, and we spent that money on women's work, like what these young girls were doing, I actually think we would catapult our societies forward much faster than some of our traditional ways of stimulating economic growth, whether it's in the care economy, social services, early learning, elderly care. I think the conversation that optimistically we're seeing in the United States and in other countries where people are infrastructure, and understanding that the care economy and care work is alongside the internet cables and other things is the infrastructure that lifts up the rest of our society. I really think that that would be game changing, certainly more effective than a lot of these like bank schemes that have not actually resulted in small businesses growing and all of this money being spent in ways that I think are not quite as transformative in the short term.
Thanks, Mariana. I think that's powerful. So we've got universal basic income from Aisha, digital literacy, access to the internet, and making that more scalable. And then Mariana about spending on women's work in care and social infrastructure, considering human potential as infrastructure. Fred, you have the last word on this particular question. Your big idea that would shape the future of work.
Tom, you know, you can't restrain me to just one idea, right? So I'm going to be worse than Aisha. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 ideas. The first, let's say, one big idea. The main central idea I would say is okay, there's some noise. The main idea I would say is this: government must get out of the way. You know, one of the things I really believe is that governments should do 3 things. They need to set the rules, they need to enforce the rules, and they need to get out of the way. Too often, an African government is in the way. They are actually blocking a lot of the solutions. Like, you know, in Africa, we have what I call the knowing-doing gap. We have all these wonderful policies. African Union has Agenda 2063. Every country has Agenda, you know, 2025. They all sound beautiful, but we're not doing things. We're just doing a lot of talk, and the government is blocking a lot of things. The solutions that, you know, for the next 50 to 100 million jobs could be resolved if government just got out of the way and really made it easy for people to do business in their countries, for investors to come in, for entrepreneurs to start businesses. This is the you know, it's not a radical idea, it's a simple idea, but I think it's probably the most important thing that we need to do, right? Now, here's my other ideas. One, I think, next thing I say is we could become the world's, you know, next pool of technology talent. Let's train 50 million young Africans in software engineering and data science and, you know, all the digital skills that the West Coast. One area that has actually grown massively because of the pandemic is technology, right? And, you know, today Google and Facebook pay a fresh college graduate $200,000 to be a software engineer. In Africa, the average college graduate makes $500 a month, $6,000 a year. So if they pay $10,000 a year, it's a huge saving for those companies, right? How do we attract the entire world to come in and get, you know, their technology talent here? And I think we should radically, you know, change all our education systems to produce software technology talent as fast as possible, because that's where the jobs of the future are going to be. The next idea I have is kind of like what Aisha was talking about. I think we need to radically reimagine our education systems, right? Throw away, because too often in Africa, we want to import best practice, right? But when you're far behind the rest of the world, you never catch up. We need new practice. We need to reimagine our entire education systems, focused not on learning theory, but more based on, you know, skills, right? That's fit for purpose, you know, higher education that's 6 months long, right? Lifelong learning never stops. You're going in and out of work and learning and so forth. Next idea, entrepreneurship as a career. Too often right now, young people only do entrepreneurship when they can't get a job, It's a backup plan. We need to make it the first choice for every young person, right? It is your job. Entrepreneurship is a career. Don't go and look elsewhere. Start coming out of college, of high school, saying, I'm going to create my own business. There's so many problems in Africa that need to be solved. And entrepreneurs ultimately are the ones who are going to do it. And my final idea is, I would say, what we need is something like a youth investment bank, right? You have where we raise capital globally to invest in young entrepreneurs, right? Because they are the ones who are more likely to employ other young people as well. But one of the things that's missing is capital. So let's raise capital. It's not going to be, because to start a business in Africa is very cheap. You don't need hundreds of millions of dollars like in Silicon Valley. Let's go and raise money and invest in our young entrepreneurs. And I think this will also be catalytic.
Thanks, Fred. That was really cheeky, 4 or 5 ideas there. So government, get out of the way, train up people on software engineering, entrepreneurship as a career, youth investment bank. I mean, some of these, I know that even our panelists might have some different opinions on, so I'd welcome that in the question and answer session as well. But we do have to get to some questions because there have been a few in the chat, which is your opportunity. Just as a reminder, please go to the chat to outline some of your questions. There's 3 questions I want to start with, and I'm going to field them to specific panelists. And this was similar to what you talked about earlier, Fred. The first one I'll direct to you, Fred, and I'll also talk to you, Aisha, because you mentioned it. What role should formal education systems play in preparing young people for the future of work? For a long time, many donors and NGOs have worked around school systems. Is it time for a rethink if we want systems change? Starting with you, Fred, and then Aisha.
Absolutely, we need a rethink. You see, most education systems were designed as knowledge enterprises, not skills enterprises, right? So universities, and this goes all the way down to primary school, secondary school, let's feed knowledge into your brain. But the world has not realized that we no longer live in a society where information is scarce. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I remember when I went to college, I was doing research for a paper. I would have to go to the library and get this thing called microfiche. And then you put in this device, and then that's how you get knowledge, you would be able to do research. Today, that information is on Google. A child in a rural area in Africa has access to more information than someone who was doing a PhD 30 years ago at Oxford. We haven't realized that. So universities continue being sources of knowledge. Meanwhile, the knowledge is much more readily available outside. So what we need is to actually flip the purpose of education to be much more focused on enabling people to learn by themselves and learn how to solve problems. And you can speed up education much, much faster. You can radically reduce the cost. You can allow people to get access to the best, latest knowledge and technologies and everything. And so we need to just go back to the drawing board and redesign something that is more fit for purpose instead of copying something that was designed for the 18th century Europe, which is what we have in Africa today.
Fully agreed with Fred, and I think universities, there's a big knowledge transfer, there's a little bit of skills transfer, and then there's also prestige. And I think this notion that as a young person you are successful when you have finished school and gone to university, and if you have not gone to university, and in many cases a particular university, you are not successful. I think that notion has to change completely. There just aren't enough universities to cater to the young people who are leaving school. I think the second thing is also just schooling itself. And Fred talked about the idea of a six-month tertiary education. I have 3 kids. During lockdown, I was trying to balance homeschooling and work, and everything else. And I realized that primarily what schooling is about is, yes, there's, the knowledge and skills, but there's a lot of babysitting as well. And I don't think necessarily that school systems need to last as long as they do. And if they do, then we should really be focusing on other types of skills within the same amount of time. So yes, the questions about tertiary education, but I think, the basic education system as well just needs to be completely different. For my own children, I would love it if they were doing half the amount of time in school, learning whatever they're learning, and the second half of their day, every day, doing far more practical things. And in fact, actually doing things in their own time. I have no problem with my kids being on, screen time, as long as some of that is productive and actual learning.
Yeah, and if we're going to get serious about scale, for education, the government is the pathway to scale, right? The government is the only entity that really is able to deliver training to the masses of youth that are coming up. And so I think we absolutely need to, while it's much harder to change, what the government education system is doing. I think it's the only sustainable way for us to really reach everyone who would benefit.
Thanks, Anne-May. I think that is a critical piece. And I think early on, we also had some questions about what collaboration looks like. You mentioned innovation, scale, and collaboration. I think collaboration across private and public sector is perhaps a way to reconcile some of what Fred was talking about in terms of what's the strengths of different stakeholders. I'm going to take two next questions, and I'll ask the questions in succession. One is, what factors would help us become risk takers? Aisha, you mentioned risk takers, and most importantly, encourage youth to take calculated risks with their careers. So that's one question. I'm going to ask Aisha to answer that, followed by Anne-May. And then the second is how to prepare youth who are not homogenous for a future of work. For example, youth already in work, youth about to enter the labor force, and youth just entering education. And I'll ask Fred to take that. So Aisha, starting with you, what would make us better risk takers? And you were a risk taker, I guess. So,
I think the first thing is just this question about entrepreneurship and innovation and trying to do things in a different way. So I think, firstly, I grew up in a household where, it was, you get a degree, you get a good job. It has, there are a set number of options that qualify as a good job, and and that's what you do. And I think that sort of thinking is just really outdated. And I think a lot of parents need to recognize that trying to push your child into a very specific vocation where there's a lot of competition, and they probably won't even make it to that stage, because of all the issues around access to university, et cetera, is just it's a waste of time. So I think in general, people just need to change the perception around what is a good vocation. I think the second thing, again, and I spoke about this, is that it's so important to have a safety net. I would never have been able to start my business if I couldn't move back into my parents' house. And we stayed there for 4 years before we were able to move back out. I think, and that in my case, I was fortunate to have parents who had a house where I could, just camp up in a room with my husband and my child. But I think government also has a role in providing that safety net to people so that you are able to start a business. And it's not necessarily, a sort of high scale tech startup, but you're able to start a business that's going to employ people and give yourself an income and career, and without the risk of that jeopardizing your ability to literally just put food into your mouth. And then I think the third thing from a risk point of view goes to what Fred said about capital being available for people to take risks. And I think whether we like it or not, entrepreneurs at some point or other are going to need money, right, to start businesses, to grow businesses. And I think there needs to be more readily accessible capital for young people to take risks. It doesn't need to be at the scale and quantum of sort of, what the tech industry is doing at the moment, but I think small check sizes for people just to be able to do something, to turn an idea into a running business. I think those three things I would say would help people to be more comfortable with risk. And then also just failure and perceiving failure as something that's inevitable, which it is, as opposed to, a signal about, who you are as an individual or an entrepreneur.
And Aisha did such a great job. I 100.
It's okay.
Go ahead, Mariana.
Go ahead, Anne-May. Finish what you're saying.
Oh, I would say Aisha did such a great job. I totally agree with all the points you made, and in terms of enabling youth to take risks. Given that, I'm going to focus a little bit more on how to help organizations or people like all of us who are trying to help figure out how to solve this problem take more risks. And to me, there's a couple things we need to think about. One is, I think it's really important to get clear on what our definition of success is and set goals that are audacious, that really truly are transformative. A lot of times I think we're just shooting too low, talking about how do we reach 100,000 youth. That sounds ambitious, but really isn't in the grand scheme of things of the maybe 100 million youth that we really need to be thinking about. So we need to be much more ambitious. And when we are ambitious and when we set a goal that is not just directional but is concrete, what that means is then if we continue with business as usual, we will definitely fail because we can plot the trajectory and know where we're going to reach. So we need to flip risk on its head, where by not taking a chance, by not trying something new, it's actually a bigger risk than trying something new where you might have a chance to succeed. And so I think getting clear on setting a clear goal where you can't achieve it with business as usual is the first step towards really innovating. And so I think we really need to start there.
I wanted to actually, on the theme of education systems, I don't know why, Fred, I keep picking back on you. So on the one hand, government get out of the way is right, where government needs to create an enabling environment. But as we think about common good issues like education, the mantra is actually government get it together, because if we don't have like systemic solutions, and again, we're all trying to understand what the role of different actors in collaborative structures and ecosystems is. I feel like Anne May's point about aggregating the stuff that's often sitting outside of government, it just can never solve. It can never solve at the scale and as quickly as what's needed, with all of the caveats of government get out of the way in some of those spaces. So I wanted to unpack that, I think, a little bit more with you.
Yeah, so for me, when I said governments get out of the way, I'm talking about get out of the way of the economic activity that creates employment, right? So governments too often are frustrating entrepreneurs, they're frustrating investors, they're not building the infrastructure that would make it easy for entrepreneurs to get started, investors come in. So that part is where they need to get out of the way, so that economic activity can take place in the country. Where they need to get their act together is in changing policies. That is what their job should be, to change the policies, to redesign this education system the way it should be, to produce people with skills and not just theory, to create the social safety net, and that's what we need, to invest in a new form of primary education, secondary education, all those things, and that's where they need to be involved, right? So of course we can't do this at scale without government, but government should do the right thing. And right now they're often doing the wrong thing, which is, Africa, I've always said, is going to live or die because of leadership. And that's the big elephant in the room here. Many of Africa's problems can be solved if we do the hard things we need to do as leaders, make the tough decisions, and break through the barriers that we need to actually solve these problems. That's what we're not doing.
Well, on that point, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the challenge is that often in our contexts, like I would argue a reliable supply of electricity is probably one of the most important things to keep the economy moving and pumping, and government's got to focus on getting those kinds of things done. But the role of government in spurring economic growth, maybe not, we'll make that our next panel, is one to really try to understand where the levers are that extend beyond policy making. But thanks for that for now.
Thanks, Fred and Mariana, for the provocation. I heard Parag Mehta yesterday on a panel about making capitalism more inclusive say this statement. I think he's from the Center for Inclusive Growth in MasterCard. If you want to go deep, go with community partners and NGOs. If you want to go wide, go with governments. If you want to go fast, go with the private sector. But if you want to go far, go together. So that underlines the point around collaboration. And I think it was a really handy phrase which stuck in my mind. So we probably have room for one more question before we turn to sort of the rapid fire conclusion round. So one question that was asked, and it is a question that comes up a lot with the future of work, which is, why don't we ever discuss farming and animal husbandry and agriculture, the sectors that need investing into Africa to create more jobs along a fuller value chain, and while also feeding young and growing populations? Does everyone really need to work in tech? And I'm going to ask May and Aisha, both as tech experts, to respond, but others are welcome as well.
I'm really glad you raised that, Charmy, because I do think that we overly glamorize tech. I come from the tech sector, but one of the things I recognize in the tech sector is we don't actually employ a lot of people. I don't actually know the numbers off the top of my head, but Google employs a minuscule number of people relative to Walgreens while having a much bigger market cap. Right, and so while the tech gets all the attention, it doesn't actually create that many jobs. And so, even though it may be less sexy, I think agriculture is a huge opportunity in Africa, and we should be looking at those opportunities as well. The future of work is not going to be in any one sector. It's going to be across a wide number of sectors. The reason that I talk about access to broadband, however, is I think that technology is going to be more and more a factor across all those sectors, even agriculture. You're going to get better information about agricultural practices, connected markets, connected financing through access to technological tools. But that's different than working in the tech sector itself.
I couldn't agree more. I think when I say sort of the tech, I'm always trying to sort of differentiate between startups and digital technology is just a tool, and with a good business idea, ideally this technology helps it to scale faster, and have more reach. But what people need to learn are just basic sort of digital skills. It's not necessarily about technology. Agriculture plus tech is what allows it to scale its impact. And I think tech in that sense is what we mean.
So, Shami, if I can comment on this one, I think that it's not an either or, right? I think, tech is definitely a big opportunity, pure tech, deep tech, learn how to code. There's lots of jobs in that space, right? And we need to capture that opportunity right now because it's also a great way where you can do remote work, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, there's also a huge opportunity in Africa in what I call the unsexy industries, right? Like agriculture. We import about $40 billion of food into Africa, that we have perfect soil and weather conditions to grow. That's a travesty in my mind. Those could be millions of jobs. That could be, but the age of the average smallholder farmer in Africa is 60 years old. So where are all the young people? You're saying that they should be going into, but not just farming, but the whole value chain of agriculture, right? So supply chain management, agri-processing, agri-tech, all those things that can, make the full value chain come to life. Another big opportunity is in, for example, sanitation, right? You have 700 million people moving to African cities in the next 40 years. They're going to create a lot of garbage. Who's going to become the garbage billionaire in Africa? Simple business. Figure out how you're going to clean the cities up, right? Healthcare, education. We have a lot of problems in Africa that need to be solved. And these are not sexy problems, right? And the good thing about many of these jobs that technology cannot yet disrupt them, right? Because we have such basic infrastructure to build. We have to build our cities, we have to build our roads, we have to build, figure out how to bring energy to people. And these are all jobs that can be created, and they're not going to be disrupted by technology for quite a while. And this is where I think again we're not living up to our full potential in Africa.
Can I just
Thanks, Fred. I'm going to have to.
I just want to vigorously agree with Fred, because I think that we're learning that no amount of tech stops us from needing to eat. No amount of tech stops us from a huge amount of basic functions that need a lot of human power to get those jobs done. But what I will say, and I think it's really Anne May's point, is tech is about enabling. I mean, most agriculture, if we think about where some of that innovation is about how tech is helping people think differently about what's done, and that there's opportunities. But the last point, which I think has been a big learning for us at Urumbi, is I think, Fred, it's about how to make that work sexy for young people. Because if I'm just waiting for that formal sector job to appear, or if I think the only reason to go down that road is to become the billionaire, that's not going to be enough of an answer for the billion. And so how is it that we, as a society, understand how to make all that non-sexy work be very sexy, I think, for this next generation?
Thanks, Mariana. We only have time for a rapid fire round of conclusions from our panelists. And I'm really sorry that Jessie's hasn't been able to join with her audio, but I do want to ask you four specifically, what are your calls to action to make the future of work more inclusive? What is your call to action to the audience, to employers, to government, to policymakers? And I'm going to start with you, Anne May, and then to Aisha, Fred, Mariana. And
yeah, this has
May,
been a
go ahead.
fantastic conversation. Thank you all. I just feel so privileged to be among this great group. I'll just go back to what I said earlier, which is innovation, scale, and collaboration. I really think that those are the roots. We focus so much on the what of this solution or that solution. Some people are excited about jobs in agriculture, some people are excited about jobs in tech, but regardless of which area you're excited about, remember to focus on figuring out how do we learn faster and become more agile. How do we really develop a pathway to scale to the real size of the need? And how do we collaborate across sectors to bring the best of each of our sectors together in order to, in order to capture all the possibilities that are out there?
So I was just reflecting on the conversation now as we were having it about tech and, whether it's sort of the using tech to scale these sort of unsexy industries. And I think, what we don't want is an Africa where either we are the customers who are buying technology from other countries and we have no capability to develop those things ourselves. And we also don't want a situation where technology is being developed for people who don't look like us, don't have our life experiences, don't have the same values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in that way, we just become completely, excluded. So my call to action would be to everyone to just view tech as a tool that should be accessible to everyone, to kind of imagine when you think about tech as something that's scary. For example, imagine if you, at the age of 3 or 4 or 5 had, an iPad or the equivalent of an iPad that had all of the information and learning that you would need for the rest of your life. Like, I don't think it would feel as scary if that was the situation. And then I think the second call for action would be to government, if there is anyone here who's representing government. And, I think it's absolutely imperative for young people to be represented in government far more. I think these are people who are more intimately familiar with the questions that we're talking about. These are people who are going to be the stewards of the future. I think people need to hand over and share a bit more.
Thanks, Aisha. Fred, and then Mariana.
My last word would be new practice, not best practice. I think it's time for us to really look at what our unique solution is in Africa and reimagine everything. Use this moment where we have a lot more constraints to reinvent education, the way we work, how young people think about government, everything. Let's use this moment to really come out in a new and better way than we were before. And it's time to stop talking and to start doing.
I thought about a call to action for sort of others, but actually I want to really build off that last point. I think the call to action is to each of us individually, because I think that crisis breeds opportunity, and what we need now are new mental models. We need to change entrenched assumptions and rewire society, and we're not going to get there with new initiatives and big sweeping plans alone. And I think this question of tackling how we work within our own organizations and with other partners, in addition to focusing on what needs to be done, I really do think that there is like a significant moment to rewire the how, and in that, I think, catapult the what. And I think if we can use this as a time to push our partners, so is this a time to push people and really, I think, use the urgency of the moment? Is it a time to call out the kinds of things that have been standing in our way in these collaborative structures and put the kind of burden on others to see that they are the problem in whatever way is appropriate? But we can't squander the moment. And I think that using African solutions for global challenges, I think it's the time. It's the time.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. And May, Aisha, Fred, Mariana and Jesse, even though you couldn't join fully. We're so grateful for your time. Thank you for all of the participants and attendees for the questions, and to the Skoll Foundation and the Skoll Work Forum for coordinating such a fantastic forum. We are super grateful, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. We are hoping that Africa provides solutions for the rest of the world in the next decade to come. Thank you all for joining.